I am a consumer. I've collected Lord of the Rings miniatures, replica swords, Lego sets. I've played multiple video games. In Games Workshop's Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, you can field armies representing Middle-earth's heroes and villains against one another. You can even pit Bilbo against the Balrog in a duel and see how long he can survive for. In games like War in the North or Battle for Middle-earth 2, you can fight battle after battle in Middle-earth. In some games, you can even play as the forces of evil. I've watched the movies, I've read the books, I even know why Viggo screamed so surreally in this scene. I'm an official Lord of the Rings fan. So, why does something feel off? Why does pitting Bilbo against the Balrog in epic gladiatorial combat feel wrong? Maybe I just answered my own question. In light of the upcoming, highly expensive Amazon Middle-earth set TV series, that uncomfortable feeling has grown, sped throughout me like I've been stabbed by a Morgul blade. Are my collectibles really an appreciation of Tolkien's masterpiece? Or are they just plastic products selling off of modern-day Lord of the Rings fandom's infatuation with epic battles and visually stunning combat spectacles of the movies? As Kirsten Pullen writes, fans want to believe in the integrity and authenticity of their experience. The Lord of the Rings demonstrates how that experience is shaped by new media technologies and new media audiences. To put it plainly, there is a disconnect between the presentation of war in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and what we experience in modern-day adaptations of the Middle-earth world setting. It's more subtle than I initially hypothesized, but it's there, and it's all about context. A quick disclaimer. I likely never would have been introduced to The Lord of the Rings without the movies, and I really do like the movies, and admittedly my Legos and swords. I'm not saying you can't enjoy these either, but it is important to recognize the growing differences between Tolkien's original ideas for Middle-earth and how it's often portrayed today. In this essay, I'll be providing a brief timeline for The Lord of the Rings connection to war, in order to highlight the similarities and especially the differences that lie therein. We'll start this quest with the legend himself, J.R.R. Tolkien, Englishman, conservative, Christian, philologist, staunch defender against claims that his work is allegory. Tolkien created Middle-earth over decades of European war. He wrote during his time in World War I. He wrote between World Wars and later while his son was deployed in World War II. World Wars were the backdrop for his sub-creation that is Middle-earth. As Tolkien said himself in his essay on fairy stories, a real taste for fairy stories was wakened by philology, on the threshold of manhood, and quickened to a full life by war. Croft develops this further, clarifying, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are by no means allegories of that or any other war, yet the impact of the Great War is evident. His wartime experiences bled into his writing, and they are difficult to unpack. The portrayal of war in The Lord of the Rings isn't ironic, like what Tolkien's contemporaries wrote, and it absolutely isn't propaganda in support of the war. Combat heroism and bravado, traditionally masculine or patriarchal traits found in mythic tales that Tolkien studied at Oxford, underlie the acts of the forces of good. Some of the characters are even self-aware of the mythical, heroic role they find themselves in. In The Two Towers, Sam says, "I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into." Regarding this, Croft writes, participants in the Great War often had a sense that they were acting in a play, wearing costumes, delivering their lines, making grand entrances and final exits. While this is not a metaphor Tolkien used very often, it has its parallels to the feeling of being in a song or tale. Myths and heroic roles inspired and consoled the literary-minded British soldiers in the Great War, acting as an antidote, a small measure of order, against the world of chaos around them. Tolkien was no different. In Return of the King, the writers of Rohan even sing before battle, for the joy of battle was upon them. In a fictional conflict against a hyper-industrial, dominating, and purely evil entity, war, in Tolkien's eyes, is not only justified but perhaps even enjoyable, as represented in tales of ancient battles and myths. Yet it's not that simple. The world and heroes of Middle-earth are forever changed by the conflict. Take the Scouring of the Shire, a deeply important chapter in Lord of the Rings, yet missing from Peter Jackson's theatrical adaptation. The Shire is the pastoral haven, the equivalent of the English countryside in Middle-earth, though not allegory. And as Great writes, recourse to the pastoral is an English mode of both fully gauging the calamities of the Great War and imaginatively protecting oneself against them. Yet as seen by the end of the book trilogy, war is transformative, its consequences inescapable, even to the sheltered hobbits of the Shire. Frodo and friends return to a destroyed, industrialized Shire that's dominated by ruffians and a figure named Sharky, aka Saruman. Their peaceful home has become a victim of the war that they help to end. The characters themselves are changed as well. Tolkien writes in Return of the King that Frodo is wounded with knife and sting and tooth and a long burden. He's physically and mentally scarred by the conflict. These are just a few examples, but we begin to see that Tolkien was obviously not blind to the torment of horrors of war. The War of the Ring and its fantasy battles underpin the Lord of the Rings narrative, but allow many other themes to arise from it. Friendship and domination, nature and industrialization, free will and fate, community and singular power, among others. Although not allegory, it unmistakably arose from Tolkien's experiences during World War I and observing World War II. The Return of the King is published in 1955. Years pass, and with them come the Cold War and the Vietnam War. This will be a brief detour, but we need to talk about the hippies. As I said, real-world context is everything with The Lord of the Rings. Amidst tensions of the Cold War, and with it the Vietnam War, global social concern was at new heights. Many American students felt the Vietnam War threatened their own lives if they would be drafted to serve in that war and possibly die. Reactionary counterculture movements, grounded in the ideas of community, nature, and anti-industrialism, found a voice in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Jane Chance writes, "The popularity of Lord of the Rings coincided in the late 50s and 60s with a contemporary need for escape from the political and military tensions racking the world and for stability in an increasingly unstable environment. Just as legends of virtuosic, brave heroes consoled the British soldiers on the front lines in World War I, including Tolkien, the archetypal characters in Quest of the Lord of the Rings provided firm ground for the hippie movement to stand upon. Frodo lives, so they say." Here we have another time jump. Feel free to get some lambus bread. The year is 2001, and the landscape of cinema is about to be changed forever. The Lord of the Rings is about to make a resurgence in popular media through release of Peter Jackson's movie adaptation of Fellowship of the Ring. Before that, though, is 9/11. The World Trade Center is destroyed, the Pentagon struck, and the last hijacked plane brought down in Stony Creek Township, Pennsylvania. 2,977 people are dead. Under the Bush administration, the War on Terror has begun. Context is everything. The entire trilogy is brought to the silver screen through the course of the War on Terror. And just as Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings is a product of the world during world wars, the movie trilogy is a product of the world during the War on Terror. Ken Gelder articulates, "Novels and films are quite dissimilar, enable various readings, and have disparate effects in diverse social contexts. In an era of terror war, the Lord of the Rings film cycle enjoins patriarchal and crusading militarism that reflects Bush's crusade against terrorism and a post-2005 as-yet not articulated crusade against tyranny. The movie trilogy is connected to the War on Terror, even if only indirectly. Releasing concurrent to an American war against an elusive terrorist organization in foreign countries, Gelder points out that Tolkien's Christian conservative ideas rose through the heightened spectacle of the movies and into popular culture. He says, Jackson's trilogy does not flinch from showing bloody killings, corpses strewn about on the battlefield, and the melancholy horrors of war. Conflicts between courage and fear, and goodness and greed, lay at the heart of the narrative that has a strong sense of mortality of human beings. Yet the evocation of finitude, contingency, and the frailty of human life is undercut somewhat in The Return of the King, as Gandalf solemnly invokes belief in an afterlife, another path, to higher states of being. Gandalf evokes the white shores and beyond of the afterlife, bathed in a glow of white light, obvious invocations of a white Christian heaven and the possibilities of salvation. The trilogy has more to do with conservatism and militarism than faith in Christian redemption. Gelder argues that the emphasis on war in the cinematic trilogy is deeply connected to the American culture's opinions on militarism, that through the impact of their movies, more conservative views during wartime could gain power. He continues to comment on the militaristic proclivities of the film trilogy, which invests its greatest energy and cinematic elan in these spectacular war scenes. As a Christian, white American myself, Gelder's argument is an interesting pill to swallow. Yet it does provide fascinating insight into the movie trilogy's connection to wartime, and in particular, how the Lord of the Rings story can be used or perceived differently, depending on the necessity of the culture at the given time. Indeed, with each boom in cultural significance of the Lord of the Rings is a generation of people seeking validation or justification in what they're fighting for. In the 1970s, hippies were chanting "Frodo lives" in anti-war protests, but the movie trilogy release of just a few decades later refined more conservative and militaristic ideologies through the imagery of heroes, clothed in white, as Gedor points out, engaged in epic, large-scale battles set to an incredible musical score against forces of evil. Only the creation of Jackson's movie trilogy, an adaptation and thusly a separate entity from Tolkien's original work, could have accomplished such a stark contrast in general interpretation. Gelder says, "The ring could stand for capital and the way that greed for money corrupts individuals. Yet the cinematic militarist and patriarchal spectacle of The Lord of the Rings is so great that more progressive readings are undercut by the mise-en-scène and its presentation by Jackson and his crew. The more progressive ideas are still there in the early 2000s, in both the books and the movies. Tolkien's love of nature in opposition to industrialism, his themes of community and individual quest are still there. The words haven't disappeared from the pages or sections of the movie scripts. Instead, the cultural focus of the early 2000s, in accordance with cultural necessity of the War on Terror, was set on huge CGI-filled war scenes rather than Tolkien's other more important themes. The cultural microscope was set on the charge of the Rohirrim, on the Battle of Helm's Deep. After all, what else could a fantasy action movie offer? How about merchandise? The world, especially Britain, and the aftermath of the two world wars, the hippies during the Vietnam War, Americans during the War on Terror. Each major audience to Tolkien's work had mass conflict behind its popular appeal, just as Tolkien experienced mass conflict when writing it. The Lord of the Rings is recurring in relevance, seemingly timeless. But what about today, without any major global-scale wars transpiring? What backdrops the Lord of the Rings audience or fandom today? Capitalism. The movie trilogy was made to make money. It made money, and it still is. Ian Conrich writes, "The phenomenal global reception of the Lord of the Rings cycle is partly the result of the new film market's determination to maximize lucrative concepts. There is a dependency on an existing popular appeal, character familiarization, and the opportunities offered by heavily financed, digital effects-driven, extended narratives for the creation of a film franchise. The movies were created with the idea to sell products in mind, a thought that very likely never crossed Tolkien's mind when writing The Lord of the Rings. The difference in intent alone creates a total shift in authenticity in general storytelling. Tom Bombadil, the jolly immortal being who lives in the woods, can get wiped from existence, since he will not sell well. The Uruk-hai can now have a badass leader named Lurtz, who can be sold in battle sets against Aragorn, and so on. War sells, not only because it's immediately exciting, but also because that's what people broadly know The Lord of the Rings as, since the film trilogy released during the War on Terror. Awesome fantasy war. My little miniatures are no exception," Conrich says. "As part of the gaming culture, Games Workshop produced a tabletop strategy game tie-in, which promises battle reenactments from the film. The game is all about the wars, nothing of the friendship in nature. How do you package and sell friendship in nature? Beyond this, mass-produced merchandise for The Lord of the Rings ranges from the expected posters, mousepads, books, bookmarks, calendars, mugs, postcards, trading cards, board games, computer games, puzzles, apparel, magnets, and keychains to the less familiar. Regarding video games, there are games such as Lord of the Rings Conquest, which focuses solely on hack-and-slash combat. You can even bash people's head in as Sauron. I think it's funny to imagine Tolkien in a rocking chair playing this game. Or strategy games like Battle for Middle-earth 2, which Croft goes on to describe. In strategy games, players usually gather resources, build bases, train armies, then explore terrain and engage in battle with opposing forces. These kinds of activities are rarely mentioned in either the literary or the film versions of The Lord of the Rings. Pitched battles, the other staple of strategy games, are also relatively few in the films. Although there are passing references to a considerable number, the protagonists themselves only experience the following three: Helm's Deep, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, and the Last Stand at the Gate of Mordor. No, I'm no stranger to video games, and I have played the Battle for Middle-earth too, but it always felt strange to me, like I was watching algorithms and subroutines churn out visuals that wore the skin of the Lord of the Rings, but never actually was it. Some ideas still carry forth, such as in War in the North, a game which I played and admittedly remember enjoying, but not the powerful themes of nature and community. The small group of fighters who are victorious against overwhelming numbers is a feature of Jackson's films. The trope can be traced back through Tolkien's novel to medieval romances of the Crusades, in which white Christian knights defeated vast armies of the Saracens, their Muslim enemies whose origins in the Middle East and North Africa were often specified in the poems. Beyond video games, which focus almost solely on combat, are toys of orc warriors, Lego sets of major battles, and collectible prop replicas of swords. There's a strange contradiction present here. In consumers' culture, one commonly displays their appreciation for an idea or art form by owning things, symbols, banners, statues, etc. But as faithful readers to Tolkien's original trilogy will know, and what is even portrayed in parts of the movies, Frodo and Bilbo didn't live meaningful lives through the contents of their hobbit holes, but rather by the dangerous, exciting, transformative quests that they endeavored upon. The personal quest, as well as community, culture, and an appreciation for nature, can't be represented through a display of material objects. But the concept of fantasy war, with swords, dragons, and white castles, can be easily marketed for their material quality and spectacle. Presently, due partly to the movie trilogy, the aftermath of the War on Terror, and capitalism, war is attractive in the West. Therefore it sells. People want to engage in war, just one form of the mythic individual quest, and indeed they can, simulating with a game controller in the comfort of their hobbit holes. In conclusion, the general perception of war regarding Tolkien's Middle-earth setting is incongruous with the world he initially built, due to the shifting nature of cultural necessity in perceiving a story, or in the case of today's fandom, cultural desire. So, will I give away all of my Lord of the Rings video games, swords, toys, and miniatures? I honestly don't know. If I need to be reminded of why I like the Lord of the Rings so much, shouldn't the book on my shelf just be enough? Yet I received most of the merchandise I own as gifts from friends or family over the past decade of being a Lord of the Rings fan. I have a warm memory attached to many of the objects I own, who gave it to me, what the occasion was, and so on. That makes the relationship between merchandise and Tolkien's original work even more complex. Studying the Lord of the Rings in almost any facet promises a deep and rich troll cave of information, and although I don't yet have any firm answers of my own regarding today's militaristic merchandising of Lord of the Rings, this research certainly helped me to organize my thoughts. So I challenge you to consider your position in the Lord of the Rings fandom, or any other fandom that you partake in. Are you truly appreciating the art form, or are you caught up in the cool toys? How deep can you go into learning what really inspired your favorite book, movie, or TV show? I'll be considering these questions myself. In the meantime, Bilbo has a Balrog to slay.